The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me as I stepped into the grand foyer of the estate I had tended to for years. The polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of the crystal chandelier above, its opulence a stark contrast to the seething rage simmering inside me. "Isabella!" His voice, a sharp bark, echoed down the hallway. I clenched my jaw before turning to face him. James Davenport, self-proclaimed business mogul, billionaire by inheritance, and, most importantly, the man who had just humiliated me in front of his dinner guests. He strode toward me, wineglass in hand, the deep stain of Cabernet still fresh on his silk tie. I had cleaned that tie countless times, along with the rest of his expensive wardrobe. Not that he ever noticed. To him, I was just the help. "You lazy piece of garbage," he sneered, his voice thick with entitlement. "I asked for one simple thing. One, and you can't even do that, right?" I felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on me. His dinner guests, bankers, lawyers, men who had never lifted anything heavier than a pen, were watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. To them, this was entertainment. James shook his head, exhaling sharply. "I pay you, so you better do exactly what I say. That's what you're here for, isn't it? Scrubbing my floors, fetching my drinks, cleaning up my messes?" I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. "Not yet, Isabella. Not yet." James Davenport had no idea. For 6 years, I had endured his cruelty, his offhanded insults, his impossible demands, the way he looked through me rather than at me. He treated his housekeepers like disposable rags, something to be used and discarded when they had outlived their usefulness. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to find out, was that the mansion he lived in didn't belong to him. It belonged to me. And tonight, he had finally given me the perfect excuse to take back what was mine. James thought he was the owner, the king of his castle. But in reality, he was just a tenant, living in a palace that was never his. And soon, he'd find out the hard way. I forced myself to remain calm, to play the part of the obedient servant one last time. "My apologies, Mr. Davenport," I said, my voice measured. "What would you like me to do?" He rolled his eyes. "What do you think? Clean this up." He gestured to his stained tie like it was the end of the world. "And be quick about it." I nodded, lowering my gaze as I reached for the cloth tucked into my apron. As I dabbed at the fabric, he chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Pathetic," he muttered, just loud enough for his guests to hear. A ripple of laughter spread through the dining room. I memorized every single face in that room. They would all remember this night. Because tonight was the last time James Davenport would ever insult me. James didn't notice that as I cleaned, I subtly pulled a single key from my pocket. One identical to the one he carried on his own keyring. My key. The master key to the entire estate. A key he had never questioned when I first arrived as a humble housekeeper. After the humiliation ritual was over, James turned his back to me, returning to his guests. I excused myself, making my way down the familiar halls of the estate. My estate. I passed the towering bookshelves in the study, the grand piano I had played as a child, the ornate mirror in the hallway where my mother used to fix her pearls before stepping out for charity galas. James thought he was born into power, but this house had never been his. It had belonged to my family long before his. And now it was time to take it back. By this time tomorrow, he would learn the cost of his arrogance. As I reached my quarters, the small, tucked-away servant suite at the back of the mansion, I pulled out the final document I needed. A legal eviction notice. Signed, sealed, ready to be delivered. James Davenport had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And soon, he'd pay for it. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight. I sat at the small wooden desk in my quarters, the soft yellow glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper. In front of me lay the final pieces of my plan, documents I had spent years preparing, waiting for the perfect moment to set things in motion. James had just given me that moment. I traced my fingers over the edges of the eviction notice. It was real. It was happening. For 6 years, I had scrubbed the floors of my own home, dusted the chandeliers my grandmother had chosen, polished the banisters my father had run his hands over as a child. And every day I had listened to James Davenport bark orders like a king addressing his lowly subjects. I had swallowed my pride. I had let him believe he owned me. But it wasn't for nothing. There was a reason I had endured it. My family had built this mansion over a century ago. It had stood as a symbol of our legacy, passed down from generation to generation. But wealth doesn't guarantee security, and after my parents' sudden deaths in a car accident, the vultures had descended. Debt collectors, fraudulent business partners, a legal war I was too young to fight. By the time I turned 22, the estate was in shambles, caught in a battle that drained every penny of my inheritance. The mansion, my home, was seized, auctioned off to cover manufactured debts I had no way of refuting. And who had bought it? James Davenport Sr., a man who had known exactly what he was doing, taking advantage of my grief, my inexperience, buying my family's estate at a fraction of its worth. He had promised to take care of it, but the moment the papers were signed, he stripped it of everything that made it ours. Paintings, sold. Antiques, auctioned off. The library, gutted, its rare first editions tossed aside for modern decor. Then he died, and his useless son, James Davenport III, inherited everything. A spoiled brat who never worked a day in his life. A man who saw legacy not as something to be honored, but as something to be exploited. He turned my home into a trophy, a playground for his vapid parties, a place where money and power dictated who mattered and who didn't. I could have fought for it back then. I could have tried to win it in court. But I knew James. He would have burned the mansion to the ground before letting me take it. So I waited. I became invisible. I let him hire me as his housekeeper. He never questioned why I wanted the job. To him, I was just another faceless worker, eager for whatever scraps he threw my way. And for 6 years, I played the role perfectly. Every contract, every financial transaction, every carelessly discarded document he left on his desk. I copied them all. I watched. I listened. I waited. Until now. I folded the eviction notice carefully, slipping it into an envelope. I owned this house. On paper and in blood. What James never realized was that his father had only bought it under a fraudulent loophole, one that I had spent years unraveling. And the final nail in the coffin? James never read his own contracts. He had spent millions on parties, investments, business ventures that failed before they even began. He had taken loans against the property. Loans he never repaid. The mansion was collateral, and last month the bank had sold that debt. To me. James Davenport III was no longer the owner of this estate. He was a tenant living on borrowed time. I closed my eyes, thinking of my parents. I wondered if they would be proud. Some might say revenge wasn't worth it, that justice was better left to fate. But this wasn't just revenge. This was restoration. James had stolen my home, my dignity, my family's history. He had treated me like I was beneath him, like I was nothing. But he was about to learn what it felt like to have everything taken away. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into his office not as his housekeeper, but as the woman who now controlled his fate. The morning sun bathed the mansion's marble floors in a golden glow as I walked through its grand halls one last time as a housekeeper. The air smelled of fresh polish and brewed coffee, scents I had grown accustomed to over the years, but today something was different. Today, I wasn't here to serve. I was here to take back what was mine. Isabella. James' voice, already filled with irritation, rang through the hallway, right on schedule. I turned the corner and found him in the dining room, seated at the long mahogany table where he often held his meaningless, power-fueled breakfasts. His silk robe hung loosely over his shoulders, his hair a mess of waves that he hadn't bothered to tame. He barely looked up as he waved a hand dismissively toward me. "Where's my coffee?" The last order he would ever give me. I smiled, calm and composed. It's on the counter, Mr. Davenport, I replied smoothly. He scoffed, already looking at his phone. And? Are you expecting a tip for that? I let the silence linger for a moment before walking over to the kitchen counter. I picked up 2 envelopes. One was his daily newspaper, wrapped in its usual plastic. The other, his eviction notice. I walked back toward him, setting both items on the table. "Here's your paper, sir," I said, my voice neutral. "And an urgent document I think you'll want to read immediately." James barely acknowledged me as he unfolded the newspaper, sipping his coffee like he had all the time in the world. Then he glanced at the second envelope. "What's this?" he muttered, flipping it over. I remained silent. His fingers slid under the flap, and he pulled out the official eviction notice, the crisp legal letterhead standing in stark contrast to the nonsense stock updates he had been skimming in the paper. His eyes flicked across the words, then stopped, then widened. The color drained from his face as he sat up straight. "What the hell is this?" I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "Oh, that? That's a legal document confirming the transfer of this property's ownership. As of today, your lease is terminated. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises." His mouth opened, then closed. He blinked rapidly as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. Then he laughed. A short, incredulous chuckle. "This is a joke, right?" He tossed the papers onto the table. "Ha, ha, very funny. Now go get my breakfast." I didn't move. Neither did my smile. "Mr. Davenport," I said, steady, deliberate, "I would strongly suggest you read the fine print, because as of now, this house is mine." James picked up the papers again, his hands shaking slightly now as he read more carefully. His lips parted as he processed the reality. "Wait, this says the bank sold the debt. What does this mean? How the hell—" "It means," I interrupted, finally allowing my voice to harden, "that you've been living in this house on borrowed time. You took out millions in loans against this property, loans that you never paid back. The bank repossessed the estate. And when they put your debt up for sale—" I leaned in, watching his entitlement unravel. "I bought it." James shot up from his chair, knocking over his coffee in the process. The cup shattered against the pristine floor. "No," he growled, jabbing a finger toward me. "That's impossible. You're just a—" He caught himself. He almost said it. "Just a housekeeper. Just the help." I folded my arms, raising an eyebrow. "Go on. Finish that sentence." His jaw tightened. "You're lying," he spat, his voice dangerously low. "This is fake. There's no way you could afford this. You don't have that kind of money." I shrugged. "Oh, but I do," I said, stepping back as he fumed. "I've been preparing for this moment for 6 years. Watching you, studying your habits, your expenses, your reckless spending. I knew this day would come. You just never saw it coming." His hands clenched into fists, his breathing rapid and shallow. "What do you want?" he demanded. "Huh? Is this about money? Fine. How much? Name your price." I laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, James," I sighed, shaking my head. "You still don't get it, do you?" I stepped toward him, slow and deliberate, until we were nearly face to face. "This was never about money," I whispered. "This was about taking back what was stolen from me." James flinched, confusion flashing across his face. "Stolen?" he echoed, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Did you really think you owned this place? That your father just found this mansion and added it to your family's collection?" I scoffed. "No, James. This estate has been in my family for over a century. My parents owned this house. My grandparents before them. This was my home before you were ever even born." I watched realization dawn on his face. "My father." "Yes," I confirmed. "Your father stole it. Took advantage of my family's tragedy. And when he died, he passed his dirty little secrets down to you. James took a staggered step backward, gripping the edge of the table like the room was spinning. "You're lying," he whispered. But his voice held no conviction. I pulled one last document from my pocket, a weathered deed to the house, signed in my grandfather's name. The final proof. I dropped it onto the table in front of him. "Read it and weep, James." His gaze flicked between me and the papers. The man who had mocked me, insulted me, humiliated me for years, was now powerless. I had won. James stood frozen, his fingers gripping the eviction notice so tightly that the edges crumpled in his hands. His breathing was uneven, his once arrogant posture now slouched under the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. The mighty James Davenport, who had spent years belittling me, mocking me, treating me like I was beneath him, was falling apart right in front of me. And I wasn't done yet. This isn't over," James spat, his voice shaking. "I'll fight this. I'll call my lawyers. You can't just steal my house." I raised an eyebrow. "Your house?" I repeated, letting out a slow, amused chuckle. "You mean my house? The one you and your father stole from my family?" James's nostrils flared. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" He sneered. "Fine, maybe you tricked the system. Maybe you found some stupid loophole. But I'm not leaving. You hear me? You can't just throw me out like some stray dog." I crossed my arms. "Oh, but I can," I said, tilting my head. And I already did. I stepped to the side, giving him a full view of the security team now standing in the doorway. James's face paled. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Since you've refused to vacate the premises voluntarily," I said calmly, "I've taken the liberty of hiring professionals to help you pack." His eyes darted between the two uniformed men standing just behind me, their expressions unreadable. You're serious?" he stammered. "As serious as the eviction notice in your hands?" I replied smoothly. "You have exactly 24 hours to collect your things and leave. And if you refuse? Well," I smiled. "The legal team handling this transition is very thorough. If you don't pack your things, they'll do it for you." His mouth opened, but no words came out. James Davenport, the man who had humiliated me, degraded me, treated me like a disposable servant, was powerless. But he wasn't done fighting yet. I could see it in his eyes. The desperate flicker of a man trying to conjure up a way out. He slammed his hands against the table. "Let's talk, Isabella," he said suddenly, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "We're both business-minded people. We can make a deal." I sighed. "A deal?" I repeated, feigning interest. "Yes." He straightened up, pretending to regain control. "I'll buy the house back from you. Double what you paid. No, triple." He let out a breathy chuckle, as if the very idea of money solving all problems was self-evident. I shook my head. Not interested. His smile faltered. "Come on, Isabella. Be reasonable." That word, reasonable. A word that men like him always used when they were backed into a corner, when suddenly fairness mattered to them. I stepped forward, planting my hands on the table. "Did you ever offer to be reasonable with me?" I asked, my voice cold. He swallowed hard. "For 6 years I worked in this house, my house, and you treated me like dirt. You mocked me. You humiliated me in front of your guests. You called me garbage, James." His jaw clenched. "And now? Now that you're losing everything, now you want to negotiate?" I let out a slow, humorless laugh. "That's cute." He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "You don't have anything I want, James. Nothing you could offer me would make up for what you did." I leaned in, lowering my voice to a whisper. "I'm not here to bargain," I said. "I'm here to take back what's mine." James turned toward the security team, his panic setting in. "You can't let her do this," he snapped. I'll call the police. I'll have you arrested." One of the security guards, a man built like a tank, smirked. "Sir," he said, calm but firm. "She's the legal owner of this property. If anyone calls the police, it should be her." James's eyes widened, darting between them and me. It was over. No escape, no last-minute save, no power left. The mighty James Davenport had lost. His face twisted in fury, his desperation turning to rage. "You're a vindictive little—" I raised a hand. "Careful, James," I said softly. "You don't want your final words in this house to be something you'll regret." His mouth snapped shut. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slumped back into the chair, his face ashen with defeat. "What do you want from me?" he muttered, voice hoarse. "Nothing," I said simply. "I just want you gone." I turned to the security team. "Make sure he's packed and out of the house by morning," I instructed. "And if he tries to destroy anything on the way out—" I turned back to James, narrowing my eyes. "Have him escorted off the property immediately." The guards nodded. James knew there was no point in arguing. He was done. For the first time in his life, someone had taken something from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. I turned to leave, my work here finished. But before I walked out the door, I glanced back one last time. James sat in his chair, staring at nothing, his hand still clutching the eviction notice like it might somehow change if he just looked at it long enough. "Enjoy your last night here, James," I said, my voice calm. Because tomorrow, he would wake up to a new reality, one where he had nothing, and I had everything. James Davenport was gone. By sunrise, the mansion was silent. I stood at the grand entrance, arms crossed, watching as the last moving van pulled out of the driveway. The once pristine estate, which had echoed with his arrogance for years, now belonged only to me, and it had never felt so peaceful. But James? James was about to learn what true loss felt like. I took a deep breath, stepping through the double doors into my home. Truly mine again for the first time in years. The air felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for this moment. Gone were the expensive but soulless decorations he had filled the mansion with. The designer furniture, the tasteless modern art, the shallow displays of wealth with no real meaning. This house had been restored to its rightful owner. I ran my hand along the wooden staircase railing, memories flooding back. My mother's laughter in the sitting room, my father's voice carrying through the halls, my childhood spent in rooms that had been stripped of warmth when the Davenports took over. But now it was mine to rebuild. And while I enjoyed my victory, James was out in the real world, facing his first taste of failure. The fall of James Davenport wasn't just personal, it was public. By the time he woke up in his luxury penthouse, one of the few assets he still had left, the media had already caught wind of the Davenport mansion scandal. The headlines spread like wildfire. James Davenport evicted from family estate. Legal loophole or fatal mistake. Wealthy heir loses multi-million-dollar home overnight. Who's really to blame? Power shift. Former housekeeper becomes mansion's true owner. The last one was my favorite. James always lived for status and perception. He thrived on being untouchable, superior, the king of his own world. And now that world was crumbling. I didn't have to lift a finger. His own arrogance had done the work for me. I wasn't surprised when my phone rang that afternoon. James's number flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Twice. 3 times. Then finally I answered. "Isabella." His voice came through, hoarse and strained. I said nothing. A silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I let him sit in it. Let him feel the weight of what he had lost. "Look," he exhaled, clearly trying to regain whatever scraps of authority he had left. I may have reacted badly yesterday." I smiled. "Did you?" I asked, voice dripping with amusement. He hesitated. I I want to meet, he said finally. Just to talk. No fighting. No insults. Just a real conversation. I glanced out the window, watching the wind sway through the trees of the estate. I don't think so, I replied. James scoffed. Come on, Isabella. You can't seriously be this petty. What do you even want? To watch me suffer? I considered that for a moment. No, I said slowly. I don't care about watching you suffer, James. I just care about one thing. And what's that? He snapped. I smiled. That you never step foot in this house again. Silence. Then, you think you've won? James growled. You think you've beaten me? I sighed. James, I'm not playing a game. I already won. You just haven't accepted it yet. He exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding through the phone. You're going to regret this, he muttered. I laughed softly. Oh, James, I said, my tone light. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And with that, I ended the call. James had lost his home. But soon, he would lose everything else. Because what he didn't realize was that his family name wasn't as strong as he thought. With the scandal in the news, his investors started pulling out. His father's former business partners, men who had once backed him without question, were now questioning his leadership. By the end of the week, whispers in the corporate world were growing louder. If he couldn't even keep his own house, how can he manage a company? Is Davenport Enterprises even stable anymore? Might be time to move our investments elsewhere. James wasn't just falling. He was free falling. And I was finally free. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my mansion, a glass of wine in hand. For the first time in years, I could breathe. No more hiding. No more swallowing my pride. No more being treated as invisible in the home my family had built. This was my fresh start. I had thought revenge would feel like fire and fury, like an explosion of satisfaction. But standing there, overlooking the city, feeling the crisp night air on my skin, it felt like peace. James had spent years taking from others. Now, for the first time, he was learning what it felt like to have something taken from him. And I had nothing left to say to him. James Davenport had always believed in one thing. He was untouchable. His wealth had shielded him from consequences. His family name had smoothed over his mistakes. His arrogance had convinced him that no matter how many people he crushed beneath him, he would always rise. But now, he was drowning, and no one was reaching out to save him. It had been 2 weeks since James had been thrown out of the mansion. I hadn't heard from him since our last conversation, the desperate phone call where he tried to bargain, to threaten, to cling to whatever scraps of power he thought he had left. But I had kept an eye on him, not out of concern, out of curiosity. James was unraveling faster than even I expected. His penthouse, once a symbol of his wealth, was now swarming with reporters trying to get a statement from him. His business empire was crumbling, investors pulling out faster than he could react. And worst of all, his so-called friends, the same ones who had laughed at his jokes while I scrubbed his floors, had abandoned him. When you're at the top, everyone wants to know you. When you're falling, they pretend they never met you. James was still clinging to one last hope. His company, Davenport Enterprises. It was the last thing keeping him from completely losing everything. But what he didn't know was that his own board of directors had already decided to cut him loose. And I was about to witness it happen. I didn't have to go looking for James. He came to me. I was in the mansion study, my study now, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Miss Isabella," she said carefully. "You have a visitor." I already knew who it was. James stood in the grand entrance looking like a ghost of the man he used to be. His usual arrogance? Gone. His perfectly tailored suits? Gone. Instead, he looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Shirt slightly wrinkled. Hair disheveled. He had aged years in just weeks. For the first time, James Davenport looked like a man who had lost. I walked toward him slowly, my heels clicking against the marble. "James," I said smoothly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his messy hair. "I need your help," he admitted. I let that statement sit between us for a moment. Then I laughed. "Help?" I echoed, tilting my head. "You must be joking." James clenched his jaw. "I know I treated you badly," he said, voice strained. "But you have no idea what's happening right now." "Oh, I think I do," I mused, crossing my arms. "Your stock has plummeted. Investors are fleeing. Your company is on the verge of collapse. And if I had to guess," I tapped my chin, "your board of directors is probably meeting right now, deciding whether to remove you as CEO." James stiffened. That was all the confirmation I needed. I had been right. They were going to kick him out of his own company. And he knew it. James took a slow breath, trying to keep himself together. "I just need time," he said. "A few weeks to rebuild. I can fix this. If you—" I held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there," I said. "You're not here because you think I'll help you. You're here because you have no one else left to turn to." His silence was deafening. James Davenport, the man who had once called me garbage, was now standing in front of me begging for mercy. And he knew I wasn't going to give it to him. "You used people your entire life, James," I said quietly. "But now, there's no one left to use." His hands clenched into fists. "I made a mistake," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" I repeated. "James, you didn't just make a mistake. You made a lifestyle out of treating people like they were beneath you. You built your world on other people's suffering. And now?" I shrugged. "Now you get to see what it feels like to be the one losing." James was shaking now. I could see the desperation in his eyes. For the first time in his life, he had no control, and it was destroying him. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You should leave now, James," I said softly, "before you embarrass yourself any further." His lips parted, but no words came out. For years, he had always had the last word. But today I took that from him too. James took a step back. Then another. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Later that night, the news broke. James Davenport removed as CEO. Board votes unanimously for his ouster. Davenport empire falls. Heir loses power, wealth, and influence overnight. I sat in my study, sipping my wine as I watched his final defeat play out on the screen. James had always looked down on me. But now? Now he had nowhere left to fall. And I had never felt lighter. Revenge had never been my goal. Justice was. James never thought he could lose. He never thought the people he stepped on would ever rise above him. But the truth is, you can only treat people like dirt for so long before they start to rise. And when they do, the fall is much, much harder. I walked through the halls of my mansion, running my fingers over the familiar walls. This was more than a victory. This was restoration. I had reclaimed my family's legacy. I had taken back my power. And as for James, well, wherever he was now, he was finally learning what it truly meant to be powerless. And me? I was just getting started.